Chapter 19, Wednesday, 8 a.m., HOA. I don't know when or how I fell asleep. What opened my eyes was a sound, a bell tone just outside in the hallway, gentle and unrelenting. Still dressed in the jeans and t-shirt I had worn the day before, I stumbled to the hallway. The bell tone moved down the hall. I started to follow it, then stepped back into the bedroom. I carefully tucked the pistol into the small of my back and respectfully tucked the folded body of the doll under my arm. Then I followed the bell to the enormous front doors. Through the one-way tinted glass, the FBI coordinator looked just as I would have expected. She was dressed in sharply creased slacks, with a crisp, white, short-sleeved blouse covered by a loosely fitting linen vest, with something between a purse and satchel slung over her shoulder. Her hair was cut in a severe style that even I knew was too young for her. Yet it was perfect for the beady eyes under furrowed brows that emanated anger. Why the hell was I bringing a recently fired gun I didn't own and a victim to an interview? On the other hand, the deceased was arguably FBI property and had attacked me without provocation. Expectation, possibly, but not provocation. After a moment, I opened the door. "Took you long enough," she said as she studied the scarred side of my face. Perhaps the picture in my file had only my good side, which wasn't anything to brag about. She immediately kicked off the interview. "You like to fight?" she asked, in an accusing tone. "No, just accident-prone," I replied. She made sure I saw her gun as she badge-flipped me, then handed me a card as she brushed by. Riley had it wrong. She wasn't a coordinator, but the director of compliance. And she wasn't FBI, per se. She was Homeland Security. I guess the letters stood for Homeland Operations Auditing or Ass Kicker. Take your pick. It felt like a dark cloud trailed behind her as she brushed past. The director strode to the middle of the massive room. Her eyes followed the spiral staircase upward to each level, and I followed her eyes, taking in the vast space in the daylight for the first time. Even with light pouring in from the tall windows, it was intimidating. Awakened by life entering the room, dust swirled in the sunlight rays. There was not a stick of furniture on the dark wood floors, which were covered with thick dust that reminded me of volcanic ash. The chandelier looked like an enormous glass Christmas tree hanging upside down, and strangely enough, it seemed to fit. The massive curved stairway far across the room no longer looked like a dragon winding up into its lair above, nor did it look inviting. The coordinator nodded appreciatively, making approving noises as she slowly spun around, hoping she might linger. I headed to the kitchen to scan the packet telling me who I was supposed to be, but she was on my heels when I reached the kitchen. Without thinking, I removed the murdered doll under my arm and tossed it to her. That bought me enough time to snag the envelope from the counter and hide it in front of me as I headed for the refrigerator. My idea was to fumble inside the fridge as I flipped through the documents, or maybe just crawl inside and hold the door shut. It was more than big enough. What happened was that I forgot about the damn packet when I glanced back at the coordinator. She had put her satchel on the island counter to free her hands. She held the doll as one might a wedding dress or a body, gently cradling it across both arms, the head lolling back. Its long blonde hair flowed down to the floor, and a thin, flat waist spread level, so that the doll's long legs reached the floor with the toes pointed out. "What happened?" she softly asked without looking up. "Try again," I replied. "Okay, why are you giving it to me?" "Your people left it here. Thought you might want to give it back." She opened her mouth but didn't protest or look up. Then she slowly slid the hand under the waist to the doll's back. Puzzled, I watched the doll's back arch slightly, and then, as though a worm was sliding from the bullet hole below the doll's right nipple, a finger emerged. The coordinator, her eyes hooded, looked at me and wiggled her finger for me to step forward. I heard the click of gunmetal hitting stainless steel as I stumbled back into the refrigerator door. "How did this happen?" she asked, her voice low and husky. The woman motioning me with a come-hither gesture through a bullet hole was not the brusque, angry bureaucrat I'd met at the front door. The barely suppressed anger in her voice was gone, as was the accusation in her eyes. "It's a long story," I replied. opening the refrigerator door just far enough to drop the packet inside and remove 2 bottles, hoping like hell I wasn't grabbing one of Riley's tea-colored waters that she mistook for beer. The HOA coordinator's lips twitched as I offered one to her and said, "Isn't it kind of early?" I had the feeling that I was supposed to argue. Instead, I set one of the beers on the counter and drained the other. Fortunately, neither was Riley's Kool-Aid. I picked up the one I had put on the counter and waited. You snooze, you lose, I thought. Her hooded eyes looked away from me as her quick, sure little hands folded the doll into a neat square of unrecognizable flesh-colored rubber. Then she gently placed the square next to her satchel and paused as though giving it a moment of silence. I used the time to take her card from my pocket. When I looked up, she was studying me, her eyes crinkling in amusement. "It's never too early or too late. Can we get this over with, Ms. Ratched?" I asked as I opened the other bottle. "It's pronounced wretched. Becky Wretched." "That's what I said. Wretched." Some of the amusement drifted out of her eyes. "There is no W. It's spelled out on the card. REUTCHID. Look, I know your job here only requires knowing how to mow a lawn and use gardening tools, but we do require that you can read and pronounce names correctly. The residents of this community expect no less. Is that clear?" "Isn't the W silent in wretched? How do you hear that?" Never mind. Your house, your rules." My brain asked my mouth, what part of needing to stay in this house do you not get? Her lips tightened as she pulled a leather-backed clipboard from her satchel, opened it, and studied the papers. "Your name?" Her eyes shot up and caught me turning back to the refrigerator to try to sneak a look at the papers. I raised an eyebrow and smiled. "My name?" "Yes, you do know your name, don't you?" I grinned. "Of course I do. It's Harding, Paul Harding. I'm sorry, Ms. Ratched, but I am surprised you're allowed to even ask me that question." She looked confused. "Why wouldn't I be allowed to ask your name? I know the name of every one of you and your backgrounds at every house in Cottonwood." My mind whirled. I knew for an absolute fact that the Marshal Service overstocked neighborhoods with witnesses, distributed in a way that mixed killers with security hucksters. The idea being they wouldn't know each other. But this neighborhood? "Where are you from, Mr. Harding?" I should have known she wouldn't give me a second chance. Fortunately, I remembered Riley telling me where I was from. "Idaho," I responded, suddenly remembering that I didn't know where in Idaho. "Ever been there?" I asked, mentally patting myself on the back. She surprised me with a smile. "Grew up there." "Where in Idaho?" "Island Park, below Yellowstone," I improvised, giving a town not far from where I grew up in Wyoming. She nodded. "We once went there on vacation. It's nice. Few too many tourists, if you get my drift." "And what part of Idaho did you grow up in?" I asked with a smile. "Cocolala," she replied proudly. I had taken Gabriella to Island Park as part of Yellowstone anniversary trip. It is on the far west side of northern Idaho, in a relatively sane part of the state. Cocolala is on the far northeast side of the state, where the sane keep their guns loaded and mouths shut. Yet she was Homeland Security, so presumably she had cleared the background checks. The alternative, that they didn't care she was crazy, was frightening. "You know what? I will have a beer," she chirped. The doorbell rang. She frowned and said, "Kind of a wimpy doorbell for such a big place. Our house next door has bells, serious bells. I only met Driscoll a few times, but that doorbell explains much of what I suspected." "I hear that. Excuse me, help yourself. Pick your poison. I'll be right back." Then I remembered the packet I tossed inside the refrigerator. "Oh, wait, you should try this one," I said, cracking the door and pulling out a Rochefort. Something warned me not to offer this woman a light beer. She nodded thanks, and I headed for the front door, keeping the large kitchen island between us. Something was off. Their house? Guess that made sense. Pick a neighborhood where you could pack them in huge houses. It was a natural extension of the efficiency push. She could be a hitman, or rather a hit-miss. I pulled Larry's pistol from the small of my back, scraping a gouge in my spine with its hammer. I'd seen guns casually jammed there only about 1,000,000 times on TV, and never heard even a hint about actors needing plastic surgery to repair the scars. I was wondering how in the hell as I opened the door. A big hand wrapped around the wrist of my gun hand and twisted it violently. Then my hand was empty, and I was falling backward. Riley saved Larry, who saved me from falling by keeping his iron grip on my wrist with one hand, while holding my gun, actually his, with the other. Both stared at me in alarm. I struggled for the moment it took to recognize them. Larry had changed from cowboy to country club and wore khakis, a polo shirt, and boat shoes without socks. Riley, eyes hidden by oversized sunglasses, a ponytail of raven hair flowing out the back of a light blue cap, wore linen slacks, sandals, and a loose blouse. She looked as though she had stopped by to pick me up for a day of shopping. I was overwhelmed by a sense of déjà vu. Bigger porch, bigger street, bigger houses, much brighter hot sun, same SUV parked out front, and two people who looked like the same people I had opened a door to a couple of days before. I think we all felt it, because we all turned and looked at the SUV parked on the curb, as if expecting to see cigarette butts flick out onto the street. I wouldn't have been surprised to see Chuck, dressed in a polo shirt, coming down the street with his foursome, all holding 9-irons. I closed my eyes, telling myself it was just overload. A lot had happened since St. Louis, or so I thought. I opened them and let out a sigh of relief. Riley now faced the inside of the house, while Larry looked up and down the street. Both held their weapons stiffly by their legs. In Larry's case, a gun alongside each leg. I reached out and touched Larry lightly on the arm. I wasn't hallucinating. "Paul, what's wrong?" he asked, his eyes concerned, probing, and worried. I took a deep breath and said, "The coordinator's here. Maybe a hitman, maybe both, for all the fuck I know." They glanced at one another and kept their hands on their weapons. "Where is he?" Riley asked. It's a she," I answered. Again, they glanced at one another. Larry glided around me to the other side of the door from Riley and peered inside. In unison, they removed their sunglasses. Larry whispered, "Thought you said it was a guy named Mark." "Yeah, that's what I was told." "Paul, how do you know she's the coordinator?" Riley asked quietly, without looking at me. "She showed me a badge and gave me her card," I whispered back. Riley pulled her eyes from the room and held out a hand. Larry didn't move. "Give me the card." I fished it out of my pocket and stepped forward to hand it to her. Taking it from me, she said, "Stay behind, Larry." I watched as she read the front, turned it over, read the back, and then reread the front of the card. It took so long that I wondered if she had to sound out the words. She looked up at me, shook her head, and put her weapon back in its holster. Larry kept his position with his gun out. Riley looked nervously up and down the street. "Put it away, Larry. We need to get inside before we attract attention. This feels weird for some reason, doesn't it?" I think it's because," I whispered. "Yeah, Paul, I get it. Shut the fuck up and go inside." Riley pushed me through the doorway. She frowned at Larry as he holstered 2 guns, one on his hip and my loner on his ankle. Then she looked at me and said, "We're going to have a little talk about that later." She handed Larry the card. He read it and looked at me in amazement. "She gave you this card?" I nodded. "Yes, and showed me a badge." He held the card up in front of me. "Dale, what does this say?" he said, pointing to the acronym in bold. I frowned. HOA. Riley said, "Do you know who the HOA is?" I felt my face redden. "How the fuck would I know? You guys have a million of these little initials for everything. I assumed it was Homeland Operations Auditing, maybe assessment. Who the fuck cares? Maybe you can explain why it's important later. Right now, I think we have a little problem with the coordinator, and actually, in case you missed it, she is the director of compliance." Riley's mouth tightened as if trying not to laugh. "Dale, it says Cottonwood HOA on the card.